With the knowledge of the fragility of our food system, as well as the incorporation and continued research for GMO crops, I've always been interested in seeds. Throughout my research, I found 5 videos that I'm going to go over today that have really sparked my interest in using seeds and saving seeds throughout the year and working on a breeding project for locally here in central Kentucky. So if you're interested in seeds and taking back control of your food system, this might be the video for you. One of the first videos that really caught my attention was one with Skill Colt and Eliza Greenman. I'll post it somewhere around here. They talk about foundation of the cooperative extension. They talk about decline of apple diversity in the United States. Rounding the corner from the 1800s to the 1900s, there was something like 16,000 apple cultivars in the United States. Now we really only have an accepted 6,000 or 7,000. But in 1910, there was this lobbyist group, and they were moving westward, and they were trying to figure out a way to come together and make some money. This movement was seeded in profits for farmers and efficiency and away from the diversification of our food system, which I'll talk about later is the entire reason why the North American continent had such a nutrient diverse food system. They began to push this idea that small diverse farms that grow their own produce plus a variety of other crops were obsolete due to being inefficient and not fitting into the new paradigm. The rise of the cooperative diversity or cooperative extension essentially eliminated diversity among fruit growers. And this is the first time in the history of the world, really, that an organization has decided for all of us what apples and what fruit and what crops should and shouldn't be grown in certain. We basically took our 17,000 apples, and the cooperative extension office says, I can't tell you how to grow those 17,000 apples, but I can tell you how to grow these 10. And so now certain areas, certain states are only growing, a limited number of varieties, and there is such a diverse amount of apples out there. Not to mention, the fruit breeding programs are breeding for their own interests, their own desires. So an apple that's getting bred for market, they don't necessarily care about the taste so much as they care about, the texture. How well is it going to ship? How long is it going to store? I'm much more concerned with flavor, diversity of things. Like I like different traits. Like a red fleshed apple is so cool to me. The different flavors that are available in apples are cool to me. The russet apples are cool. Those are things that the red fleshed apple you'll find in a market, but for instance, russets, entirely russeted apples are unlikely to ever make it into the mainstream in North America in terms of like finding it in the grocery store. And this is also where the rise of the stupid expert culture came from, where you're going to an authority who's an expert on the matter and you're asking them for what they can say. Well, why, yes, there is going to be people that are more informed on certain topics. There's no, like even in apples, 16,000 apple cultivars. There's no way for one person, one office in a state to know everything about every apple, But because they're labeled the expert, a lot of people take their words as gospel, when really they're only an expert on the, 15 or 20 different available trees. And back then, the farmers were also making, like their own selection. People were growing out, so say Kentucky. Kentucky farmers were all growing out their crops. And in certain regions of Kentucky, say central Kentucky, they were all pooling their seeds together in one, say like farm store, seed location, whatever. They're pooling their seeds, taking notes, having conferences, discussing what plants are doing well, what pests are prevalent, this, that, and the other, what varieties are doing well with the pests, what varieties aren't. And it was a farmer-driven system. And the farmers were losing their ability to make selections best suited to their farming practices and their environments. Rather than pulling everyone together to discuss the best of the best and farmers discussing what's actually working, it turned into, this is all we're going to sell and keep data on. This defined the market and really told people what they could and couldn't grow. Eliza's project is very interesting. They go over it a little bit. She has a hogtree farm, what she calls the hogtree farm. And she has different paddocks located around her farm, and each paddock has, you know, like a certain drop time. So say she has a June orchard, and this will be, you know, all of the June apples and, you know, maybe peaches and mulberries that are available at that time, and she'll load down that paddock. So then they have, you know, a little bit of supplemental, I think she supplements in feed a little bit, and then they're grazing for whatever they're able to find. You know, a lot of people will use old heritage breeds in this type of method, where they're, you know, more inclined to forage for insects and grubs and things like that, rather than just opening their mouth to be fed. So she'll have a June paddock, a July paddock, an August paddock, a September paddock, and at each time, each of those paddocks have different drop times. So she'll have her September apples all in the September paddock with, you know, the earliest persimmons, and then she'll have late dropping apples all the way out into, you know, maybe not November, and then she'll really have persimmons for the rest of the season. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, that hogs are usually harvested at, you know, beginning of the fall, middle of the fall, somewhere in October. So it would be the trees connected to the livestock, connected to the humans. So it would just be this system of, you know, the people eat the animals and eat the plants. The plants are being fertilized by the animals, and the animals are taking out the pests and diseases, and then the humans are propagating the seed. It would just be one big full circle. And I believe that all home gardeners should be seed keepers. If you are wanting your food to taste better and be more nutritious, and I believe that lies squarely on our shoulders, because the breeders of these big commercial farms and commercial breeding programs are not necessarily have the same goals in mind as the home gardener. And the next one is the Skill Cult Bite Me video. He is a homesteader out in California who is interested in breeding of plants similar to me. He grows, you know, apples and I think daffodils and potato onions and leeks that I'm aware of. Those are 4 of his big projects that I've seen. And he just does breeding efforts. And his very first seed apple from a cross that he made, he crossed a Wixen with something, I think, and it gave him an apple, and the very first one he was able to name. That's very different from the, you need 10,000 apple seedlings in order to find one good commercially viable crop. So that is the modern or the popular consensus, and the popular consensus is not always true. So that is good to keep in mind. This isn't the only person who I've seen have good success on their first go around. Kareem from Keeper's Nursery over in the UK, I think it's Kent, he also got some good varieties on his first go around. He said that apple breeding programs at universities talk about the need for 20,000 or 40,000 trees in order to be successful, with untold amount of labor hours. This may cause some apple enthusiasts to not even attempt or have not attempted to breed apples because of this. Who has 20 or 30 years to trial apples and examine to grow out the fruit? Kareem said his experience is 10 seeds of known good parent genetics, 10 seeds of apples will produce at least one good tree. And that's 5 to 7 years. 10 seeds, 5 to 7 years, and you've got at least one good tree. So that's at least good enough odds for me to want to be interested in trying. But he has noted that, you know, it's not the same as growing one from the grocery store. You have to find something with known genetics. So like my farm, we only have, 40 select cultivars, and all of the cultivars are edible. All of them are good. All of them are, desirable. Like the crab apples we have are Wixen crab apples or Whitney crab apples. Things that are historically known for being good cider apples as well as good eating apples. And because of this, we have good parents. A lot of these commercial orchards will have, not necessarily good tasting crab apples to pollinate. They'll just have, a crab apple that has the longest pollen window. So it flowers for the longest, and that's why they picked it, right? And maybe the fruit is awful. You never know from a grocery store. So in terms of sourcing your genetics, it's important to source from an orchard that has, or to source from vegetables with known good genetics, good flavor, good parentage, good pollen availability. Kareem also noted that he believes that apples need to be updated in a way that commercial breeding programs don't see as important. So, like, for instance, commercial apple orchards are looking for crispy, crunchy dessert apples, fresh eating right off the tree. Well, what about dehydrating apples? An apple that's great for being dehydrated. What about an apple that's great for a fruit leather? What about an apple that, you can just core it, throw whole apples in a stock pot, and come back in a little bit, and it's applesauce, and it's perfect applesauce. There are a lot of things that an apple can do that they're not necessarily being bred for. And some of the best tasting apples in the world are russeted apples. If you really get in, I know I'm talking a lot about apples right now, but they're the main crop that I'm interested in breeding, mainly because it's the long-term goal. That one and pawpaws. But some of the best tasting are russeted apples. If you look into apples a lot, some of the best tasting varieties historically throughout the world have been russeted, and they're unmarketable in the United States. People won't buy them probably at the market. People are unlikely to buy them at they're not even sellable at the grocery store. So my plan is to use the orchard as a launch pad. I'll be selecting seeds from our favorite tasting apples and pears throughout the years, starting them off on seeds and doing a project similar to Skill Cult. He grows them out on seedlings for a year, grafts them on a dwarf fruit stock because they're going to fruit in 3 to 5 years instead of 7, 8, 12. What we're doing here could easily outlive me, and some varieties are older than the United States. So I have some apples in the orchard that are older than the United States, which means they've been propagated since then and haven't been able to evolve with the environment. The changing ecosystems around the plant have continued while this plant has been suspended in time, just stuck. And so there's been no real genetic improvements on the plant itself. So I think it would be interesting to take some of these old varieties and revamp them for modern conditions. And then there's another video called Apple Breeding and Genetics, Tremendous Diversity. When settlers came to the U.S., they were just planting seeds. Johnny Appleseed, for instance, he would just hang out behind cider mills, grab their seeds, and then go plant nurseries out of the seeds. This was beneficial because homesteads back in the day needed X number of trees to be considered domiciled, considered a homestead. So they needed X number of apple trees, X number of pear trees, or whatever, X number of peach trees. And so Johnny Appleseed would come through with his seed nursery, and plant a bunch of seeds along the riverbanks where it was the most fertile ground. Well, this was beneficial to a lot of these settlers because, the known genetics, say from like Europe or back home, were way more expensive to graft a tree. I think the book I read said it was 20 cents for a grafted tree and 5 to 7 cents for a seed tree. So that's you can get trees at a quarter of the price, get 4 trees for the price of 1, as long as you're cool with seed apples. And apples back then were mainly used for cider anyway, so they were just blended up, squished out, made into juice, and thrown in a barrel for clean drinking water. So that was the main uses of apples back then. They didn't necessarily care so much how they tasted, as long as it was an apple and could make a cider. And the diversity of flavors in different apples, like some are bitter, some are acid, some are sharpened, some are bitter sharp, like all these different flavor profiles thrown into one barrel generally made for a better cider because it was more like full type of flavor. And then there's some other videos about land races, and one of them is called Why Seeds Matter More Than Soil. In this video, Julia Dakin talks about organic farming And her journey through organic farming, she saw that it was super resource intensive, which I agree. It takes a lot of, nitrogen additives like fish spray or, fungicides, whatever. And she saw that there was a study out there, a Bionutrient Food Association, over several years, gathered thousands of produce samples from all over the country. They had tons of data. They would compare growing practices with nutrient outcomes and soil tests, and they found out, they were looking to find out if there was any correlation between the three. The goal was to prove that regenerative farmed produce was more nutrient dense. Well, Julia didn't find the information that she was looking for and was dissatisfied. She said sometimes you could have a carrot that had 200 times more potassium than another carrot that was grown in the same soil on the same farm. That's crazy. So she was starting to, scatter plots and graphs and all these statistical methods and looking for correlations. And what she found was that it looked like varieties themselves were more nutrient dense. So it wasn't necessarily about the regenerative practice as much as the variety that was chosen. Okay, and then this led her to, should I use heirlooms? Should I use hybrids? Well, hybrids you can't necessarily save the seed on, so she was out on that. And then heirlooms would be the next step, but they've been inbred for generations to keep stable and keep, producing the same outcome every year. And because of that, they have a little inbreeding depression and they've become less vigorous over time. So the next step is land races. Genetically diverse, promiscuously pollinating, meaning you can have multiple varieties out in the field. You don't necessarily divide them distances. You let them all cross-pollinate. So you'd have a poblano crossing with a bell pepper, crossing with a banana pepper. You let it all happen. You save seeds from the most resilient plants, the highest livability, the most, it thrives the most in your droughts. It isn't harmed by pests, that kind of, you just select for your best plants. Over time, this is historically the way our ancestors have grown. They would, find a plant, a fruit or a vegetable that they liked. They would save seeds off of it, throw all seed, and then they would change seeds with friends or different communities across the river or whatever. They would exchange seeds. They would plant out all their seeds, select for their favorite vegetables. And if you'll look in land races, a lot of the times they're very rarely, genetically or identically uniform. They have different shapes, sizes, colors. Some are bumpy, some aren't. Some are lobed, some aren't. There's a lot of genetic diversity within them. It's not that amendments and composts weren't important, but Julia noticed that it was the seeds that was the most important. The Green Revolution is what, in her mind and mine, is what led to the decrease in our food nutrient density in our food. Once breeders started selecting for yield over flavor, they were looking for, this plant produces 10 squash on a plant. Well, once they did that, there's only so many nutrients available for that plant. And so say there's 200 nutrients. This is just dumb simplification. Say there's 200 nutrients, and then there's one plant that has 5 fruit. There's one plant that has 1 fruit. The 5 fruit has to divide the 200 nutrients among the 5 fruit. The 1 fruit gets all the nutrients. So that's kind of the understanding. And it's a complex topic. It's definitely not a general understanding. It's just kind of the working theory right now. The basic hypothesis is that when you select for shelf life and yield, you lose things like nutrition and flavor. Each time we buy seeds from elsewhere, those microbes are pretty useless to us here where we are, because those plants were oftentimes grown with plastic or using fertilizer or things that you're not necessarily going to do in order to grow your vegetables. This caused Julia to look into locally adapting crops, and this is what also got me into land races and locally adapting crops. Plants functionally adapt to a local area. They'll store information in the seed about their growing environment, drop it on the ground so that their babies have the best chance of survival. When you have a really narrow genetic base, you get weakness and more disease susceptibility, When you plant the seeds that you've let cross, they're more resilient, more disease and pest resistant. They're more acclimatized to your local growing conditions and environment. Principles of landrace gardening are save your own seeds, encourage diversity, no purity. We're not a purity mindset here. Encourage selection by the local ecosystem. Be okay with diversity in the crop that you harvest. So as long as it is a zucchini, don't care if it's bumpy, don't care if it's more long, don't care if it's striped. Use as few inputs as possible. Like for me, I fertilize them to get them going if they're direct seeded. If not, I just use the potting soil cup mix. The stuff that's in the potting soil is all that they get. Select for characteristics that you value. For instance, I want multiple pod colors in my okra. I want a red pepper to grow because I want them to ripen red, and I preferably start off yellow. What else? Butternut squash. I want butternut squash, but I would prefer the longer neck. Tahitian melon squash, I think is what it's called. The longer the neck, the better. It's more meaty per vine. And then lastly, share your seeds. So if all this sounds interesting, if you all are interested in, if some of these videos spark interest, if they change your mind about gardening the way they have mine, I'm gonna put some projects up on the screen here. I'm predominantly looking for people in central Kentucky, but I will take surrounding states as well. If you are interested in any of these crops listed here and starting a locally adapted breeding project, reach out to me. I will send you some seeds or plants, whatever, and we can see what we can do. And I just ask that you return the seeds as a thank you after the growing season, or after, if it's trees. Hope that you stay in contact. I plan to get an email marketing type deal set up to where I can, help you throughout the season on what needs to be done. Like in the fall, you need to mulch certain things, if you can water at certain times of the year. Certain plants need more water than others. Certain plants need more conditions than others, need planted in certain site requirements. So I plan to get like an email marketing campaign set up for all these crops. But yeah, if this sounds like something that's interested to you all, let me know. But if not, this video is way too long. So just no expert, just a guy with his hands in the dirt. Peace out, produce people.